Hello, I'm Sally Bushell from Lancaster University, where I'm a professor in Romantic and Victorian literature. And I'm going to be talking with you today about Frankenstein and about using contextual information to sort of enrich and deepen your understanding of the text. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get into a PowerPoint. Okay, so today's session, as we can see, is called Contextualising Frankenstein. And this film is going to be in 3 short parts. Part 1 here is going to be me just kind of presenting a few slides and talking you through the larger contexts that bear directly upon this text. Part 2 is sort of more interactive, and there we're going to read together and analyse Mary Shelley's preface, written in 1831, when she's sort of looking back, thinking about the writing of Frankenstein, and think about, well, what actually motivated her to write this text? You know, how did it come about? And finally, part 3, we're going to read and compare in detail her account of the preface and actually the kind of vision, the dream that came to her that then started Frankenstein specifically. So in a way, across those 3 parts, I'm sort of starting further out, zooming in a bit and zooming right in. And that's kind of what you need to do when you're thinking about the context for a text. Go further from the outside and work your way in. Obviously, if you're a teacher using this resource, you could just do parts 1 and 2. You don't have to do part 3 as well. Okay, so let's move on and get into that context. So obviously the question I guess I'm posing there is, you know, where does literature come from? And what we see in the case of Frankenstein, which is, you know, a sort of one-off text, is a very unique text, and so is the context for writing it. So that the context seems to be arbitrary, but actually it's really extreme as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think those extreme conditions bring about a kind of extreme text. So in this first section, then, I'm going to look at the historical and geographic context for writing, just touch upon Byron's poem Darkness, which you can go away and have a look at for yourself. And then we're going to work into the actual text a bit more in parts 2 and 3. So I guess the key thing to say or to know is that Frankenstein was written in 1816. And the year prior to that, in 1815, there was a kind of massive ecological disaster, I guess, on a worldwide scale that bears directly upon it. So many miles away in Indonesia, on the island of Sumbawa, there was a huge volcanic eruption from the mountain that you can see below. Obviously, it's now a caldera. It's a collapsed volcano, but that's where it came from. And it ejected 100 cubed kilometers of material up into the upper atmosphere. I mean, that's a lot, isn't it? The effect of that massive eruption was to cause a drop in the Earth's land temperature and to create sort of very odd weather conditions worldwide because of all the dust and material that was then in the upper atmosphere, the stratosphere, and meant that sunlight could not pass through. So, as a consequence of this event in 1815, the following year is known as, it was called at the time, the year without a summer, 1816. It was the effects of the eruption were so severe on Europe that it was just kind of stormy and dark the entire summer. So remember that Europe has just finished the Napoleonic Wars, which end in 1815 with the Battle of Waterloo. But that also means that Europe's been at war for over 15 years, and everyone is pretty poor and depleted by this already. The effects of the eruption actually caused 3 years in total of bad summers with no proper sunlight, And as I've said here, candles had to be lit even at midday because it was so dark. So you can imagine, you know, the kind of day which we sometimes have in England, where it's just terrible weather all day, you don't even want to get out of bed, but it's like that the entire summer. And the effect of that, especially of low temperatures and heavy rain, caused the harvest to fail. And of course, this then had sort of drastic consequences. So what we find is that 100,000 people died in Indonesia, which is pretty bad, from the eruption, but 1 million people died of starvation because of the famine caused in Europe. And the eruption also led to a cholera pandemic. Again, we're very familiar with the concept of pandemics, which have occurred, of course, over history many times, in which tens of millions died. So, you know, the fallout, literally and metaphorically, from this volcano is pretty severe. In 1816, Byron, Lord Byron, another famous romantic writer, wrote the poem Darkness in response to this, and I'll just give you the start of this poem, very dramatic. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless. And the icy earth swung, blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went and came and brought no day. And Byron has this kind of apocalyptic vision, really, of sort of the end of the world. Again, obviously stimulated by these events in the weather at the time. And this is seen often as an early example of kind of eco-criticism, eco-literature. It's sort of, you know, thinking about the planet and our responsibilities for the planet, which the Romantic period starts to do. So Byron's writing his poem, but also at the same time, in the summer of 1816, Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley were staying with Byron. And Mary Shelley has eloped, she's left home and run off with Percy Shelley, aged 18. She's not yet married to him, though she's going to be. And she and Shelley are sort of hanging out with Lord Byron, who's much richer than they are, in his very nice villa on the shores of Lake Geneva. And his doctor Polidori is also there. So they're in a kind of group, hanging out together. They're planning to have lots of nice excursions, going out on the lake in boats, climbing the mountains, etc. But they can't do any of that because it is the year without summer. So they're stuck indoors, much more than they normally would be. And they're spending much of their time talking about current issues, science, literature, the imagination. And also, again, very much probably because of the weird weather that they're experiencing, indulging in ghost stories. Now, in the Romantic period, you also have something called Gothic, which emerges in the 1790s. And Gothic is very much, comes from Germany, with writers like Schiller, writing The Robbers, these sort of scary tales that are designed to you know, heighten your senses and terrify you, make you experience strong feelings. And this leads Byron to propose a sort of competition between the four of them staying there. And Mary describes this in the preface, which we're going to return to in part 2. We will each write a ghost story, said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. There were 4 of us. The noble author, i.e. Byron, began a tale, a fragment of which he printed at the end of his poem of Mazeppa. Shelley, Percy Shelley, more apt to embody ideas and sentiments in the radiance of brilliant imagery, commenced one founded on the experiences of his early life. Poor Polidori, the doctor, had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady. I busied myself, this is Mary, to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. One which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror. One to make the reader dread to look round, to curdle the blood, and quicken the beatings of the heart. If I did not accomplish these things, my ghost story would be unworthy of its name. So we've got a kind of competitiveness emerging in Mary here. She's the only woman with 3 men, and she wants to do it well. You know, she wants to write something that's really going to have the effect on the reader that these stories have had upon them. So it's kind of very, very alert to, you know, how it acts upon the reader, and that's obviously true of Frankenstein when we get to it. And so what we'll see, and again, we'll look at this again in the third section of this little short course today, is Mary has a dream, has a kind of vision after talking, and then she sort of sees this scene, and this is the first scene that she ever writes, which is the moment when the creature comes to life and opens his eye. So I'm just going to read the very short opening section, and she explicitly tells us that this is the first sentence that she writes as well. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. And over here, I've just put up for you one manuscript version, because it's always nice to see the handwriting of the writer of that chapter, which ultimately says chapter 7th there. It's chapter 4 in the 1818 edition. Here we can see Mary's hand writing the base text, and Percy Shelley is amending it in various ways. Quite an interesting little detail, I think, down here. She describes the creature as handsome, and he replaces it with beautiful, which is quite interesting. It's almost a kind of less, or shifting of gender almost there. And he's adding little points like yellow, his yellow skin, lustrous black, sort of enriching the visual appearance of the creature. Okay, so I'm going to pause there and end this session, and then we'll come back to part 2 in a minute.